first up is, thank you, open for public comment. No one here. Is there anyone online?
Yeah, do we have someone downstairs?
Wait, if you can, they just came off mute.
So, Leah, if you can hear us, you have 2 minutes for public comment.
Yeah, we're trying to set up the Zoom. Can you
Perfect.
hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you. It took a minute. My name is Wea. I'm an HCV participant. I am disabled. I'm here today to talk about the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. I did leave information with Nadia about it to share with everyone on the board. I'm asking and requesting on behalf of the program more funding and wait lists to be open. And the summary that I provided is about the positive benefits for all disabled Section 8 participants in Washington County, including disabled. The Family Self-Sufficiency Section 8 program is important to not just able-bodied HCV participants. It is just as beneficial, if not more, to Section 8 HCV disabled participants. In the summary that I provided that hopefully all of you will be able to look at, I put the possible benefits and the possible solutions and the possible impact. Reopening this program to more funding and wait lists to be opened could, beneficially impact the Section 8 Housing Authority here in Washington County. I don't think I'm going to go over everything in here. I'm just going to do the possible benefits and the impact and skip the middle because you can read it and pass it around. And I'd start with the possible benefits, which is case management. I'd like to do a shout out to the case managers for that program. They're absolutely terrific and they make participants really believe in themselves and be able to set achievable goals. Personally, the person that I think has really set me on this journey 14 months ago to advocate for this program is Peter at the FSS. He's an FSS coordinator in Section 8, Washington County. So thank you, Peter, for everything you do for me. The other thing is it provides community resources, service referrals, higher education goal coaching, home ownership classes, escrow savings accounts, and information on the home ownership Section 8 program. It gives individual plans for goals, debt reduction, disability savings accounts, financial education, improving credit scores, and banking, insurance, education. ADA accommodation, rentals, permanent housing, independent living with caregivers, and with other healthcare support systems. The impacts of this program are very important because it gives a final result and it also promotes additional funding. Significant savings without immediate loss.
Wea, can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Emily in the room. We've met. 2 minutes goes fast.
Oh, okay. That's fine. It's kind of weird. It's kind of weird being on Zoom too. So
I know. We are so sorry about the elevator being out. Thank you so much for working with our staff. And thank you to Meredith, who's currently downstairs supporting some tech options on the first floor. The elevator will be fixed. Please join us again next month if you would like and continue your public comment. I'll just say I see lots of people in the room reading your handout. So it is
excellent. Well, it's all in the handout. And thank you, Molly, for your time this morning. I really appreciate you a lot and I respect you and look up to you.
Thank you, Wei, and thank you for being prepared and for the handout.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other public comments? No. Okay, so next up is roll call. So we'll start with Chris Iosa.
Here.
Dave Bachman,
Here.
I am here. Gina Casperone. Paul Cummings. Here. John Epstein. Oh, and I also skipped Bruce Dickinson. Then Kimmy, sorry about that. Rochelle Lucas.
Here.
Haley Purdy.
Here.
Nina Stafford.
Here.
Nathan Teskey.
Here.
And Debbie Walton is not here, and I have an update on that here in a minute. That completes our roll call. So next up is any updates from our members? Anything to share? All right. So moving on to the executive director's report, and Molly is going to share that with us.
Good morning, everyone, and happy April. For those on the call who may not know me, I'm Molly Rogers. I'm the executive director here at the Housing Authority of Washington County, and I use she/her pronouns. It's great that we're getting some public comment testimony here and there. It's been a while since we've done that, so it's great hearing back from folks who are actively participating in our programs about what that is like. But April is Fair Housing Month, so I just want to take a moment to reflect on what that really means for us. It's a big month in the housing world. It roots back to the civil rights movement. And we know that discrimination is very much alive and well in Washington County. So we do see that in the work that we do, and we acknowledge that we need to do better. We did have a proclamation with our commission, and they got to reaffirm our commitment to fair housing. And in this moment of where we've been with this current federal administration, we've had to frankly change some of our language around diversity, equity, inclusion. And we have unveiled what we're calling a fair housing statement that reaffirms many of those same values of inclusion and diversity and diversity, equity, inclusion. I just want to take a moment it's on our website, but I did want to just take a moment to share and read out loud a portion of our new fair housing statement with you all. The last part, I think it's really powerful. By strengthening fair housing protections and improving access to housing opportunities, we aim to build a universally accessible county and prosperous future for all Washington County residents. So I just wanted to shout out to all the folks who worked really hard in reaffirming our work that we do with you all. So I wanted to share that with you. The irony is not lost on me that in the midst of Fair Housing Month is the time when we are having to most grapple with a proposed new HUD rule. And public comment was due just this past week in affecting what we call mixed status households. So we've talked about this here in the last few months. But I did want to just elevate it and raise it one more time because we had last month we delegated Chair Kane to help work craft our own statement and public testimony or public comment that we all submitted on this Housing Advisory Committee's behalf. And that statement was submitted. I believe it was part of the packets. Nadia, yes, part of the packet. Great. So that is great. We also had our Homeless Solutions Council also submit public comment as well as the Housing Authority Board of Directors. So appreciate you all who were part of that effort with us. And public testimony just was due 2 days ago, midnight. Yep, that's how I stayed up late. So check that out. There were 8,000 at that time.
Wow.
So well, that was based on a month ago. So we'll see what the update really comes in and how many. All the other I did scan. I couldn't help myself of all the other proposed rules and how many comments were coming in. This is by far, in a way, the most commented at least this point in time. It's really, we got to update our board on what would actually happen to the 39 households affected here in Washington County. And just to remind everyone, that's 75 kids living in those households, and over 100 total household members. We're working with the Housing Authority Association of Oregon so we can collate a statewide number of affected households. We haven't tallied all the housing authorities yet, but it's exceeding over 500 households. Interestingly enough, the state also administers a program called the Multifamily Section 8 program. They also have affected households. So it is really going to affect everyone across the country. It is, I just cannot say it enough how devastating and frankly cruel this feels, in that we have a program that already meets the spirit of a policy objective, which is to not subsidize someone who may not be eligible based on their immigration status. We already don't subsidize, and we have prorated rates for those households. So essentially what this new rule would do is force families to either separate those family members who are not eligible or terminate assistance altogether. So we are working really closely with with as many of our electeds as we can, and advocacy groups and trade associations, and really trying to understand, make sure the folks at the national level are understanding impacts of what they are proposing. If this does go into effect, likely there'll be legal challenges, because we without having a legal opinion, just as a layperson, it does appear to violate fair housing rules around national origin. Again, that is not a legal opinion. That is just based on 25 years of experience of fair housing, that if does seem to not meet those thresholds. So, but if this goes into effect, essentially we'll be having 30 days to notify those households and start a full verification process that we would have to roll out over the course of a year or two of every household, to make sure every person in that household has the right citizenship through the National SAVE database. I actually just want to take a pause there. I do have other updates, but I do want to just pause there and see if anyone has any questions or comments.
What would be the financial impact on staffing to go through all of that information?
It's an excellent question. We've also had, it is an administrative burden, not just obviously an administrative burden and a cost impact for all those households who may not have all the documentation ready to go for that verification. So I just want to start there, that it will be a financial impact to all of our participants. It will be a financial impact to Hawk in terms of additional staffing. And it does mean, because people are getting a prorated subsidy, pulling us back means we end up serving fewer households overall. So this is not a cost-effective solution either. So it ends up meaning more people having less housing stability. Anything else that you want to add to the impact, Liz?
Financially, I think you really hit it. It really is gonna impact the people finding the documentation alone, let alone, but then our staff members. And it does, the system is not an easy system to navigate. It's not just a one and it comes up for each household member. You have to go back into it. So sometimes it's touching that same household member 2 or 3 times to get the information that we need to deem for what they're requesting is acceptable.
All right, so we just moving on from that topic. You may have seen we've had a lot of media attention lately this past month as well. It's been a bit of a kind of an interesting month. We started off having to work with our board, who got a request from Portland Mayor Wilson, requesting that Washington County and Clackamas County help fund the shelters in downtown, in the west side of Portland as well as the east side. So Washington County is asked to fund 3 shelters on the west side of Portland, and Clackamas County was requested to fund 3 of their shelters on the east side of Portland. So there was a work session that our board convened to contemplate the request coming from a leader, local leader. And they essentially had requested 6 million from Washington County. So each of the commissioners went around and they unanimously voted to deny Mayor Wilson's request for the $6 million to fund those operations, and Clackamas County Board of Commissioners did the same. They didn't do an official vote, I don't believe, but did more of a statement with their chair. So it's a little bit of I think it's the end of the day, it's a canary in the coal mine of how every level of government is facing budget constraints and lots of uncertainty. And at every single, and everyone is looking through, frankly, all the push cushions and making requests that maybe have been unprecedented in prior times. So it is a really a challenging time we're going to face at the state level and the region as we all know, Portland has faced, they proposed a budget with $160 million reduction. And Multnomah County is facing similar proportional levels of deficits. And so we seem to, we're working on our own county budget. We're having to take some reductions in our general fund as well, not to the same degree as our other jurisdictional partners. So I just want to make you aware of all that, of the local pressures that are happening. And of course, we got media attention. We're getting a lot of neighbor elevation of some of our new siting of our transitional housing project. And we are very aware, we have testimony of folks coming into our board, and we have directly engaged with as many folks as we possibly can who've coming in, but we were working through a process that is called a good neighbor agreement. So we're honoring that good neighbor agreement, and we have meetings with that neighborhood about every other month. The next one is in July. I just want to make you all aware, since sometimes this does happen from time to time as we're citing shelter or transitional housing, pushback from the neighborhood. So you contrast that, we're doing it, we're having same in community engagement process with the community out in South Hillsborough called Reed's Crossing. We're citing a pod village or a Safe Rest Village called the Central County Safe Rest Village. That is actually expected to open before the transitional housing project opens in Cornell Road. So that one will be a longer community engagement process because it's going to take us longer to open up that project. And then to work with Central County and working with, we're having active conversations with the neighborhood association as well as the homeowner association. Nadia, did you finish?
We're running a little.
Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you, appreciate that. So it's, I just wanted to make you all aware that I heard from some of you and some are just making sure we're being responsive to that community. I think it could be a good update, maybe a future impact meeting from our community relations team of sharing a little bit more about how we have been engaging the neighborhood, and then frankly, how we're planning to do some additional work over the summer months. And last but not least, I wanted to just elevate a story of hope with you all. It's nice really talking about folks who have benefited from the programs we're putting out there. This one is about Jackie. Jackie is someone who was homeless for 2 decades and really struggled with mental illness, mental health. And we were able to really connect. Jackie was able to connect with New Narrative. So thank you, New Narrative, to work on both mental health and housing stability with Jackie. And Jackie now lives in stable housing through our regional long-term rent assistance program. That's our SHS funded, essentially voucher, and has been able to maintain sobriety now for 3 years. and has regained her stability, support, and is now part of a bigger community. So just wanted to share that and say you can learn more about Jackie in our March newsletter. And by the way, if you're not a part of our newsletter distribution list, Nadia, I want to make sure I get everyone's name on that newsletter so you
Yes.
can read more about stories like Jackie. And last but not least, we are hiring another one more manager position. Thank Gabi on board. We have one more manager recruitment. This is a homeless system evaluation and data manager. Please spread the word. Really important position for us to understand how we interpret the data and keep us accountable in ending and preventing homelessness. Thank you, Nadia, for that. Hey, with that, I'm happy to open up for any questions.
Hopefully you hire someone and then everyone will only be doing what, 3 people's jobs? I did want to thank everyone for the last meeting and allowing me to represent the advisory committee with the letter of supporting those families, and that did go out, so appreciate it. Anyone else have any comments or questions for Molly? All right, so we are moving on to the staff liaison update.
And I'm going to go ahead and take that if in the interest of time. Emily Roots, Public Relations Supervisor. First, you may notice the screen is not flickering. I want to give, yes, just a note of appreciation to Martin and Nadia, who had multiple meetings the last month with our IT department to get that sorted. So hooray for that. Let it be a distant memory. Next update, our bylaws were approved. Thank you all so much for voting to move those forward last month. And they have now been approved and blessed by the Housing Authority Board of Directors, our first time updating our bylaws, I think in close to 10 years. I think the most relevant immediate update for all of you is you'll notice you have a finance professional or real estate on your name tent. We now have a lot more flexibility in how we recruit new members. So of course, all of you bring that expertise to your role, and that is important and lovely, but it gives us more flexibility when we are recruiting folks, that we are not looking for, one very specific skill and expertise when we are appointing folks to the HAC. So we will update name tents next time around and give us a little more flexibility. And speaking of appointing folks, we are actively in the process of recruiting folks for 2 seats to the Housing Advisory Committee for residents within our programs. We received 70 applications between folks who applied specifically for our Resident Advisory Board and the Housing Advisory Committee. So we are spoiled for choice, which is amazing. And we will be in touch with updates at our May meeting on moving those recruitments forward. And we're also simultaneously recruiting for our Resident Advisory Board, which is companion to this space, but specifically for residents. So we're really happy to be able to kind of do those recruitments together. And then the last update I want to share, which kind of leads into our next agenda item, is that part of the bylaws was shifting from a chair vice chair scenario to a co-chair, more what's the opposite of hierarchical? Lateral. Thank you. More of a lateral model. And with that, we have a vacancy in that role. So looking forward to making an appointment today. Let's see, and Nadia, you wanted me to do a plug for the volunteer celebration event.
Oh, you all should have received an invitation to that. It's on the 29th in the evening. The deadline to RSVP was technically yesterday. If for some reason you didn't see the email or you need some assistance with that, just reach out to me.
We'll get you an in.
Yeah. I tried to sign up last night and it said sold out.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I will check with.
Okay.
Just put it on the calendar anyway.
Yeah. That's next Wednesday.
Yeah, next Wednesday.
Okay, that's it for our updates.
Any questions or comments then? Okay, so moving on to the chair update, and Emily did a great job of most of the things that happened over this last month. A brief update on the Housing Oregon's proposed budget, where they were going to cut funding for new construction of permanent supportive housing. I'd like to think with a little bit of push, they revised it to suggest $0 to $80 million in new construction versus just zero, was the final recommendation. The next step is the reason there's that 0 to 80 is there's no proposal for new funding of the service, like providing services for any new construction. So if we can get more money into services, then they will approve more money to build new permanent supportive housing. And Molly, if you don't mind me paraphrasing you, your statement of serving the most vulnerable people is important. And there's a lot of good organizations that want to serve those most vulnerable, and that's what permanent supportive housing does. So there'll be more of an update in the coming months there, but we want to support that as much as we can. And some unfortunate news, Deborah Walden has resigned from the committee, and we'd like to thank her for her service. And she gave just a very brief statement that was, it's been a pleasure meeting everyone and being a part of the committee. And Debbie feels that the work that the committee does is very important and apologizes that she has to resign. Okay, so with that, it brings up our elections. So as mentioned, we updated our bylaws, so now we have official co-chairs, and we can officially elect a co-chair versus a chair and vice chair. So that's what we're going to do now. So starting off, Haley Purdy, you have expressed interest in the co-chair position. Would you like to say a few words?
I've been asked to speak for 1 to 2 minutes. Which
Which
I can do, to tell you why I've expressed interest in to volunteer to move into this position of co-chair. So a little bit about me. I've grown up living across many states and across the world actually, and decided to go into school for a degree in architecture. Not really fully understanding what doors that may and may not open. I liked things like physics and drawing, and so it seemed like a great match, right? I got a job outside of college, working on single family residential, lots of detailing. And then I went to graduate school, and at graduate school, often graduate school challenges you and pushes you to think in a much more broader sense, which my school did. And I studied in a traveling fellowship after my graduate school program in South America, where I studied social housing and their form of affordable housing and naturally occurring affordable housing, which really kind of broadened my understanding and view of the world and architecture and the role architecture plays, and the role that I could play. And so I moved to Portland in 2015 with my now husband, and was intentional that instead of working for the 1%, I went to work for the 99, and worked for a firm called Scott Edwards Architecture, where I'm still today at. And I became a principal in 2024 at Scott Edwards, and have had the pleasure and the honor of working on a lot of community-minded work. I like to think that I've been really able to grow my understanding of how design can bring happiness and homes to others that I didn't get the opportunity to when I was working in single family residential. I believe truly that design has the ability to impact people's lives, and it's been a real opportunity, and that I'm proud of, to create change for those that I get to design for. I've also realized that architecture has the power to become an advocate for others which don't have the ability to speak up, for those we are creating homes for, as well as for our society. And I feel very empowered to bring opportunity and education to you all as to how we can all do better. and how we can create space that is better for the environment and better for those which live in it. And so that's a bit about me and why I do what I do. From a co-chair standpoint, in my development as a human and in my career, I've learned how to often be the person that is asked to be the leader, to be the captain. And at first I took real offense that I was asked to do that. But now I'm just learning that I need to lean in because apparently I'm good at it. And so I'm eager to help Ryan in finding a real rhythm that hopefully brings even more out of what we can contribute as a hack. So anyhow, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm excited at the chance to help you all out even more.
Yeah. Thank you, Haley.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it as well. So with that, is there anyone else on the committee that would like to nominate themselves or anyone else for the position of co-chair? Excellent. So just so we know, the Article 4, Section 3 of our new bylaws, if we are electing, we're going to hold an election to vote in Haley for a 2-year term as co-chair. And I think since it's only one person, we can just do yes, yeah, the yays and nays. But we need to open it up. Yeah, we need a motion to elect Haley Purdy as co-chair. And can I get a second? Second. Okay. All those in favor of voting Haley as co-chair, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Any opposed? No opposed. Any abstentions? Okay, so everyone in attendance here voted yes. So I'd like to welcome Haley Purdy as co-chair. I'm very excited about that.
There are going to be 2 architects.
That's
That's a good thing.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming today so we could have a quorum and vote, and looking forward to this next year.
See that.
Okay, so moving on, we are Jill, the Deputy Director, and Ryan, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, and Steve, the Budget Manager, will be giving an update on the budget.
Thanks so much, Brian. And let's go to the next slide. Just for the record, I'm Jill Chen, Deputy Director of the Housing Authority of Washington County. So the presentation today will just talk a little bit about us, quick overview, and then we'll go into the budget with Steve and Ryan and some of the programmatic considerations. Just for clarity, this is just the Housing Authority and not the whole department. Next slide, please. But before we go into the Housing Authority, we wanted to talk a little bit about the whole department and some of you saw this in our annual report, and some about our numbers. We are serving over 20,000 folks. That is the same size as the city of Sherwood. So just putting it in perspective about who we touch and how we touch, folks in providing housing assistance, long-term and short-term, providing shelter, both in terms of sort of temporary shelter as well as long-term affordable housing. One of the highlights that I love is the 26 capital projects, because that's a huge amount of sort of capital assets that we are putting on the ground for our community, not only in terms of affordable housing, but also in terms of for homeless services. So I just wanted to give you guys a quick highlight. This is the one about the whole department. We're going to talk about the budget later, but that's only for the Housing Authority. Next slide, please. So how does that differ, and where does the sort of break between, you can call it the department versus the Housing Authority? Housing Authority is on the right, which is in that blue boxes, And the department is sort of that beige colored one. We are sharing a lot of resources that goes bouncing back and forth. Mainly that is the staffing as well as the funding. So there is the supportive housing services measure as well as the continuum of care. So that's COC that comes from sort of the brown to the green. And then also the affordable housing bonds, the Metro Affordable Housing Bonds. On the right side is just the housing authority. And that is, you can see the budget of 142 million. I should mention that is right now, we're bucketing it into three separate pieces: federal vouchers, public housing, and sort of affordable housing development and operations. On the affordable housing operations and development, that does not include any of the funding we raise or bring in with us for the developments. Next slide, please. Organizationally, how is that structured? That's me and Molly on top. Functionally, it's the federal vouchers. That's Liz's shop. In that shop that Liz runs, which is rental assistance, we did not include all the projects or all the programs that is non-federal funded. You'll see housing choice voucher, special purpose family self-sufficiency, which was just heard earlier, and owner services, public housing, which we have heard about, including the Section 18 disposition, development and housing operations, real estate development, with preservation work in there, as well as tax credit partnerships and affordable housing. Next slide, please. And I will hand it over to my colleague, Ryan Bonsbach.
Thanks, Jill. For the record, Ryan Bonsbach, Deputy CFO for the Housing Authority. So a couple of things. Steve will talk about this a little bit more on next steps. This is a draft budget. So just kind of to orient yourself to the timing, this is a draft budget. So we're welcoming feedback, input, both in terms of how we're displaying and communicating it, as well as any of the actual content of what's in the budget. So appreciate those, that feedback and that request. We will be coming back to you next month with any revisions incorporated that we've talked about here. And then we are on that quick timeline of from our meeting next month. We'll just be briefing and getting this approved by our Housing Authority Board of Directors the following week or within about 10 days. So because of the timing of that May HAC meeting, and then when we're going to meet with our board, we wanted to give you a really good draft so that next month's presentation should be very smooth and hopefully not a lot of changes, but we can make changes as needed. Okay. So key messages on what we were attempting to do and what we are attempting to do for the next fiscal year. So one is looking at right sizing our operations and reducing our administrative costs that are cost drivers across the entire department to improve our cash flow. One thing that you'll continue to see is the integration of the Housing Authority with homeless services. So projects like Cornell Road that are bringing in programmatic expertise from our homeless services division and integrating that, especially with our real estate group, to better serve the community. And the last one is on structural budget sustainability. So we continue to have positive cash flow as a department, and we continue to have pockets within the department that are running small deficits. So we've been shrinking that, but continuing to look at making sure that in addition to being sustainable as an organization, we're also sustainable in the individual kind of team division levels, as well as our overall portfolio. So continuing to sell off our single family public housing units to make sure that our real estate portfolio is also sustainable in the long term. Next slide, please. A few budget highlights that we'll talk about. So on the housing choice voucher side, which is the single biggest revenue source of the Housing Authority, we're likely to see a slight increase in the actual vouchers, that is the housing assistance payments going out the door. So the rents that we are paying to landlords on behalf of participants, we expect a slight increase based on what was in the federal appropriations for this fiscal year. And we're expecting a decrease on the administrative side. So that is essentially I'll call it the commission that we earn for each voucher that we are administering. And that continues to be a little bit of a challenge point in the department. We're expecting $8.2 million in gains on those dispositions of the single family homes under a HUD authority called Section 18, which is going to continue to increase what our fund balance or our reserves are to support current and future development projects. And then we're also expecting continued increases in our financial position in addition to the Section 18 from other developer fees in the future and waterfall payments. All right. Okay, so we have a couple of different views that I want to walk through. So one is just going to be kind of our annual revenue and expenses, and then we're going to look at how that influences our fund balance, and then we'll look at kind of what the funding source is of each of these. And the budgeting process is like making sausage, and so I have to say right off the bat, I have just little corrections for this slide that we'll make sure you get in your next packet, but making sure that everything's always synced. So it should say 91.6 million in revenue and 84.8 million in expenses. So a net difference of 5 million. And again, we will update this slide. It's still a positive cash flow, but it will be a cash flow of, a total net of 6.8 million and not the 11.8 million shown there. But this gives you a really good idea of between those programs that Jill talked about, the federal voucher, the rental assistance program, our public housing line of business, and then our housing development and operations. This is showing you where those revenues and expenses are coming in. We did break out the Section 18 separately, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Section 18, very on a technical basis, is revenue into the public housing division because that's where the funds are generated. However, we are using those funds in the affordable housing development arena. And so we just try to be really transparent about, even though we're recording revenues in one area, we are using it somewhere else. It's been kind of an ongoing point of confusion and complexity in our budgets. And so we're just trying to kind of increase how we're communicating that.
Quick question. So your total net drops by 5, so it's 6.8. Is there a floor, like a strategic target floor on the total net? Like, is it 5 or 7? So when you put the budget together, is that something that there's a desirable floor that you're trying to shoot for?
We're looking for positive cash flow at this moment because we are trying to increase the amount of money that we have in that reserve bucket because we have these ongoing projects and we have future development projects that we'll be looking at, some of the land plots that we have. Jill can speak more to some of those kind of future developments that we have, but we are intentionally trying to increase what those reserves are. And we are running in a few of our programs like public housing and like vouchers, small annual operating deficits, knowing that we do have a fund balance, but that we are getting to the desired fund balance. So we'll talk a little bit in the different programmatic breakouts about what we're going for, but Jill, I don't know if we had a specific target in mind, but it's slightly dependent on the sales of the Section 18 homes.
Yeah. And Paul, it's slightly like Ryan's slide, it's dependent on two things. The timing of the Section 18 disposition. We do think all the Section 18 disposition will be completed by this calendar year, 2026. So in the next budget, that's why you can see the Section 18 sort of revenues coming in. The other thing that is also unpredictable is the timing of when developer fees will come in, because especially if you're converting to perm right around, say, May, if it delays a month or 2 months, your developer fees flip into the next fiscal year. So it's not that the developer fees won't come in when we go into a transaction. We're just not sure when the timing comes in.
Just to pinpoint your actual question, it really depends on the program. We want to be as close to neutral on HCD because we want to get as much money out the door to our community. We want to be, of course, positive in development and operations.
Yeah, thank you, Molly.
For the next slide.
Just sorry, real quick comment there too. That deficit on the voucher program is because you don't get enough from HUD to cover the costs of issuing those. We've talked about that in past ones, and it's a real issue because we could serve more people if if that equaled out.
And we will talk about strategies right after this to maximize that. And at this point last year, we were looking at an annual deficit in the HCV world of around 1.2 million. This year, we're looking at one of about 200,000 or just under 200,000. So we are working to bring that cost down, and we do have a fund balance that we are getting to a target of having 3 months of operating expenses on hand. So yes, there's more work to do, and we're making progress on driving those costs down.
And Ryan, one of the things about the housing assistance payment, as Ryan mentioned, housing assistance payments are slightly increasing, but the uncertainty is on our administrative fees, because that's what covers our staffing costs.
Let's go to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about fund balance on that first breakout slide that Jill talked through that had the housing authority and the housing services side. That included our fund balance. And so we present this when we do budgeting to the county. And so just trying to show some consistency there. So our beginning cash balance, or not cash balance, our beginning fund balance here in the housing authority is just around 50 million. And then the rest of that is broken out by revenues and then the types of expenditures, the expenditure buckets that you see, showing the positive cash flow and the increase of about 6.8 million in fund balance at the end of next year. I don't want you to think that we're sitting on $50 million in cash. Of this, about 20 million is in our kind of unrestricted net position, and about 30 million is our net investment in capital assets, minus any of the associated liabilities. So just to be clear about what's in there, but we're just trying to bring in that fund balance since we referenced it earlier. Next slide. And the last one is just we're trying to be transparent about the source of funding, because we do have money moving back and forth between the housing department and the housing authority. So just a pie chart of this is the source of what our funding is for our revenues for next year. So the biggest chunk obviously is the federal voucher program, and that is specific to the money that is going out the door as housing assistance payments for federal programs, not including the SHS funded long-term and short-term rent assistance. So that's just coming in the straight typical federal assistance from HUD. The next thing I'm looking at, the light blue, federal grants and public housing subsidies. These are our operating and capital subsidies that we get to administer our public housing program. You can see $2 million is not a lot for the portfolio that we have, which is why we continue to do things to right size that portfolio, like many housing authorities. And then that beautiful sage green color, $4 million comes from the Metro Affordable Housing Bond, which is money that is technically on the side of the Housing Services Department. And so that is transferred over to the Housing Authority. So that's a local Metro funded funding source. The next block, rental income and operating revenue. This is a mix. So this is all of our tenant rents and public housing, tenant rents and affordable housing, as well as the operating revenue that we get to administer the federal vouchers. So this is a mix of funding sources, but what we're calling kind of writ large rental income across the board and operating revenue. And then the last two we have are transfer from the SHS program. So another locally funded Metro program that we transfer money in order to execute different projects. And the last one is the 8.2 million on the gain of sale of the property. So the Section 18 dispositions that we're working through. So quick breakout, a couple different views to look at what our revenues are for this next fiscal year, about what's federal, what's local, and what are things that we generate through our operations and activities. Okay, move to the next slide. So a couple quick things. The number on the top that shows the FTE, that is total of all of what we're looking at, is not just the tall blue bar. This splits out FTEs that are funded by housing authority funds. So it does not necessarily mean that we have increased by 3 positions. It's really looking at whether or not the funds are housing authority or Department of Housing Services that are funding a given staff. When you're looking at that change from the 25-26 year that we're into next year, you see a decrease of a few positions in the rental assistance program. That is really due to the shift of staff who may have been supporting vouchers on the federal side previously and will be supporting ARLA, the SHS funded voucher. So it's a change in funding source of the staffing. It's not necessarily reflective of a decrease in the number of staff doing that. Similarly, the development and housing operations, it looks higher. And that represents the staff in that division who were currently supporting SHS capital projects and Metro Affordable Housing Bond projects. So locally funded ones shifting back to other real estate development activities on the housing authority side. So I hope that makes sense and isn't too confusing, but I think the key takeaway is that it represents the work that people are doing less than it represents the number of positions in an organization. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Jill and Steve.
Okay, next slide, please. Quick vouchers at a glance. This is just federal vouchers. And I noted that we had 55 million here, and it's because I forgot to add in the COC funds, and that's about another 5 million or so. That's why in the other slide, we're at 61 million. So you'll see that on federal vouchers, all the traditional federal vouchers are there. It's the housing choice vouchers, veterans, mainstream, emergency housing vouchers, as well as family youth. So this adds up to be over 3,000 vouchers. And on that sort of budget, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Steve. Next slide.
Thanks. For the record, Steve Nutter, Budget Manager. Happy to be here. So we talked a little bit about this on some of the prior slides that looked at the total budget, but from the federal voucher side, the majority of the budget, both on the revenue and the expenditures, is for the housing assistance payments. So you have 56 million on the revenue side, a little bit less on the expenditure side. As Ryan talked about as well, we have that lower FTE number this year. So the payroll and overhead number of 3.7 is lower, which is helping us to reduce that small negative balance of cash flow of $200,000. Kate brought that down by about 600,000. So we're getting a little bit closer to break even here, based on that cost allocation for the payroll. We are able, as Ryan said earlier, to cover that small deficit with our fund balance. We're starting the year with about a $1.4 million fund balance. That 200,000 of negative cash flow will bring us down to 1.2, which coincidentally matches what our guiding principle is around the fund balance we want to have, I believe it's 3 months of operating funds available.
The next portfolio we wanted to talk about is our public housing portfolio. You've heard a lot about this. This slide breaks down where we are in that public housing. This is housing that we must comply with HUD. HUD manages, they not manage it, but HUD provides us both operating and capital funds. So you'll see here that where we are. Originally, we had 244. There are some Section 18 dispo that we talked about, and you'll see that we have 27 still single-family homes for sale. The remaining single-family homes are 52, and that is one of the areas that the real estate team will be working through to see how do we manage this portfolio going forward, because there's also some multifamily homes. Mostly in these small plexes. You can see duplexes and triplexes. And you'll see this is just sort of a mishmash of very small units or small buildings or projects. And then there's the 8 specialty housing properties that has also half of it has been sold. And on that, I'll hand it over to my colleague again for the budget.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Do you have numbers on the actual apartments or units that constitute the 132? Do you actually have like the unit count?
We have the actual unit count. We also have the actual locations. So as we're going into the public housing, you can call it reimagining of what the buildings might be. We are actually looking at across the board. Not only the 52, is when you look at the 52, if they're all, say, in a cul-de-sac, does it make sense for us to do a lot line consolidation and then just put up a bigger building too? So the 132 and the 52 will probably need to do a lot more, you can call it investigation into what can be done.
Thanks, Jill. So from a public housing standpoint, if you back out the depreciation expense, we are at break even on cash flow. On the revenue side, with 3.7 million is coming from 4 relatively evenly sized funding sources. We've got capital grant. Ryan talked about, small amount of capital grants there, some public housing subsidies, some rental income, and some Section 18 reimbursement, which is going to help to cover that repair and maintenance bar you see on the expenditure side, which goes toward making sure that those properties are in proper condition for sale. We also have a little bit of payroll and overhead based on those FTEs we saw in the prior chart, some materials and services, which is basically mostly associated with utilities and insurance on those properties, and then a small amount of depreciation. The one thing I'll call out here too is this does not include the gain on sale from Section 18. We'll have that on a future slide. So this is more of just the operating side of it.
And the next slide. This is our affordable housing development and operations. So you'll see that we own 12 projects, over almost 1,000, about 900 plus 900 homes right now. The list goes from the large multifamily projects. You'll see we have the portfolio resyndications with our AHP 4, as well as phase 2. That's sort of left side, sorry. Directionally challenged. The middle is our small plexes, and those are all owned by the housing authority directly. And then on the right side is our permanent supportive and transitional housing. The items that are sort of in blue are the ones that we recently, or in this fiscal year, that we had acquired. So we've talked a lot about Forest Grove, but that one we just acquired, as well as the one that's Central County Safe Rest Village. Onward. Next slide, please. So this is just a sort of an explanation of where we are. In the previous slides, in the previous years, we talked about this path of how we're going to be moving our projects through development and what's the stage. So on the left side, this is what we have done or are still in the process of doing. And on the right side is what we're hoping to do this next fiscal year. You can see that, the AHP 4, for example, is complete. You'll see right in the middle for fiscal year 25-26, we have the acquisitions of the 2 land sites towards the end of this fiscal year. Hopefully Heartwood would start construction, and then Heartwood at the end of next year, you'll see they'll complete. So it's this sort of multi-year process that we wanted to share with you about where we are. Next slide.
All right, back to me. So we've got 2 slides for the operation development. This is just the operation side for housing, real estate. We are showing to have a $2.1 million positive net cash flow for the next fiscal year. Our revenue of 4.3 million is coming from 2 main sources. The first is waterfall payments from the Katama property, and the second is developer fee for HP phase 2. And then on the expenditure side, it's primarily, again, the payroll and overhead allocation for those FTEs with a small amount of additional operating expenses. We'll go to the next slide. So on the development side, so here's where we show the gain on sale property. So again, as we talked about, that comes in on the public housing side, but we transferred over to this budget, so we can use those funds for ongoing development work. So as a whole, we're going to show a positive cash flow of 1.4 million after backing out depreciation. Besides the gain on sales from the Section 18 homes that gets transferred over here, we have some funding coming in from the Metro Affordable Housing Bond and Supporting Housing Services measure. And we have some rental income as well that gets us to that $16.5 million of revenue. On the expenditure side, you can see where some of that money is going out for different projects. We have some money going to Woodspring, to Hartwood, to Cornell Road. And then we've got sort of an even split on some of our operating expenses on payroll, repairs and maintenance, and some of the materials and services as well. I would mention as well, this is where the bulk of our depreciation sits. So while we show a net loss of 800,000, including depreciation, when you back that out, we have a cash flow positive one. Okay, I think it's still me. So consideration slide, just one thing more of a sort of heads up. We do not currently have a budget policy in Hawk. We do on the Department of Housing Services side through the county. So I'm writing one for the Hawk side. We will bring that in next month along with the final version of this budget for your review and hopefully approval. The idea behind this is that we want to make sure we have a documented policy that establishes formal framework for how Hawk does budgeting on an annual basis, as well as adjustments throughout the year and what thresholds require what approvals from different bodies. We want to outline clear guidance for how we do revenue projections, expenditures, how we manage that fund balance Ryan talked about, and then internal cost recovery through our allocations as we share resources with Department of Housing Services, and really just put structure around our process, again, approval thresholds, and how we do ongoing monitoring and reporting to this body and to others on how we're doing from a budget perspective. So more to come. It's a 4 or 5 page Word document that we're happy to share ahead of time for next meeting. I'm excited to get your feedback on that as well. Last slide is next steps. So at the macro level, we're going to continue to strengthen the integration of affordable housing and homeless services. We're going to continue to address the structural sustainability of Hawk, as we talked about earlier, and strategically manage those reserves and fund balances. And also look at our diversification strategies around making sure we're getting revenue from all the possible sources that we can. On top of that, what I'll add that's not here is, as Brian mentioned, this is a draft. We're continuing to sharpen the pencil on some of the numbers, and any feedback we get from this body on how we portray our budget and our messaging, we'll get that incorporated as well. So with that, would like to open up any questions and feedback.
I got a question. Just on the 27 unoccupied homes, so what's the typical process for those homes? Like, how long are they marketed and sold? Do the residents end up staying in properties, or do they leave? And are they all, right now, are there 27 that are vacant?
Yeah, then on the Section 18 dispo, how we did it was, we first had hired a broker to work with us, also to make sure that they could do the marketing, right? But for all of the tenants in the Section 18 units, they are granted a tenant protection voucher from HUD, so that they can actually go to the market and look for a place that they would like to live in. We also allow them and offer them the opportunity to buy their own home, and also gave them the discount that you all asked us to, and we raised that discount like you suggested. And that was, I think we have 3 homeowners out of that. Out of the Section 18 dispo, we also found that a number of the buyers were first-time buyers, but also low-income buyers, from some of them from other opportunities. But they were sold in the market because that was what we committed to HUD. So we listed them on, RMLS. So they all went. So the ones that sold all went through that way. And On some of those, that's the remaining 27 unoccupied. We actually, the last resident, we just agreed with a port out to actually Multnomah County. She wanted to move there. So we said, that sounds great. We'll help you move out, all that. So all of these are now ready for sale. We're getting them ready for the summer selling season. So it's going to start, I think the starting of the selling season is towards the end of May, because that's when all the families start looking for new homes.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, do you have a question?
No, you go first.
Okay. On one of the slides, 27, you noted that the Quantum property is a key generator of cash. Why?
Quantum is it's almost an 800, I think it's 768 units.
Oh.
And it is all regulated at 80% AMI. Hawk is a 50% partner in that. So it's been operating and is steady. It's much more what I would call a workforce type of portfolio. We are not the operator, however, of that. We have our other partner is the operator. So we have a 50% split in that cash flow.
So then, thank you, that's very helpful to know. This is gonna be a more broad question that perhaps is not something that we can really answer in this meeting, but maybe would be something that would be great to touch on in another meeting is, so if we're talking about budget, and a property like Quantum is clearly a nice cash generator for you all. How is Hawk deciding or evaluating the need for your development in a way that is leading to the successful cash generation? Like, how are you balancing that? Like, is it
Great question.
mission driven? Are you trying to find a balance of cash and non-cash generating properties? Be really helpful to understand that better.
Yep. And I think this is the very question that we internally constantly look at. Lisa and myself and Molly and the whole team are looking at that real estate strategy on the longer term, because we also know that we cannot do only that which is 100% mission driven towards the lowest and highest needs population, like our PSH. Heartwood, we know, we've already seen the numbers before. It's needing some support from our corpus, but for us, that is also the right thing to do, right? We as a housing authority, or I should say, as the affordable housing owner, we're the only one in the whole county who does 100% PSH for the highest need, meaning those coming out of coordinated entry, single households with behavioral and substance use disorder. 100% as singles. And
Hawk is the only one doing that 100%?
Yeah, in 100% building.
In
I
Washington.
know New Narrative has some as well, but in terms of our other like Metro Bond projects, most of those were integrated. So they're slightly different populations. So you're talking of some high needs, but we're the only ones who are, I think, using our Metro bonds to try to do some more. New Narrative is also, but they haven't used Metro bonds. They're using state funds.
Okay.
So we're trying to do some of that too.
Lisa, do you wanna review? Put you on the spot.
Well, when I look at our real estate owned schedule, we want to make sure there's a balance. So Jill and I and Molly are always talking about that balance. In our plan to plan, which is our real estate strategy, we are, I think after this kind of period of intensive development that we've had and projects that either came to us or needed to happen, we're going to take a pause and really take a look at what's next and what role Washington County wants to play in the overall sphere of things. We cannot always be the entity that does the hardest housing because we won't be financially sustainable. So there is that. And as Jill mentioned, really shoring up our partnerships program is going to be a big part of that, as you can see from Quatama. I don't think we'll get that kind of deal again. But so I think there were some real opportunities for us to reflect, and we'll be bringing that back to this committee to have that conversation. We have just really been focused on the pipeline that was here when we got here and the things that have been evolving while we're here. And now it is going to be a good time for us to pause and say, okay, what's next? What does the future look like? Where does Washington County's Housing Authority fit within the overall ecosystem of housing that now exists in the county versus 5 years ago?
And I will mention, like Lisa mentioned, in one of our key assumptions, Katama is also, our goal is to explore additional opportunities with SLPs. We have heard in the market that also one of the missing aspects is maybe that middle income or workforce housing. So, it seems like the two ends, there may be some role here, but the question is, how do we balance that? And I think, Lisa, we're planning to come back on some policies.
Yeah, so we brought Brentwood Oaks to Chabad, which was a recent partnership, and we took that as an opportunity to really set up what our template for terms and conditions for partnerships is going to be. And Jill and I will be coming back to this group and to the board with kind of what we think the template should be based on that experience of really working through it. Because if you look through our special limited partnerships, or we're mostly like 0.005% partner, I mean, that Katama is really a unicorn. That each one is a very different flavor. And it would be nice to have at least some core things like a first right of refusal or things like that. So we will be bringing back those key terms to this group as a part of our overall strategy, as well as bringing back kind of a conversation about who we want to be as a developer, owner in Washington County moving forward.
That was the DevCo collaboration we talked about a couple meetings ago.
That was a very comprehensive response. Thank you very much. More than I thought I was going to get. This I know is a budget presentation, but acknowledging sometimes those next steps is very helpful. So, yeah, just as like those are things we're going to get to, because you can see in the budgets they're very impactful. So, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, mine was actually really similar. It was pointing out that the 80%, as you said, is making money. Your PSH is losing money. Your voucher program is losing money, far less than last year. Like, good job.
Less than last year.
Didn't have to dip into reserves to help fund that one. So, and it's the Section 18 disposition and the development fees that are really providing the profit, making sure that those new developments, like you said, balance, are they profitable once they're built? Or are they PSH and losing money? Because then you have to keep growing and growing your development pipeline to help subsidize it. That's not sustainable. So the other one, there's been a lot of news around the cost per individual being helped, especially in the homeless services side of things, which is very unfortunately skewed. So a chance to point out the cost per person served. I did some math. I double checked it. Hopefully it's right. Your voucher, for every voucher that's served, it's about $700 a year in your fees, like your administrative fees, and wondering how that compares to like other housing authorities per voucher.
I'm not exactly sure that the 700, we'd have to confirm on that, but how we compare to other housing authorities is those are set standard based by the HUD-SO standards. So then whatever that proration is and the amount, there's a calculation that they do for the first 600 vouchers, and then anything above that gets a different reimbursement rate. So it's kind of this interesting calculation, and then there's a proration on that, and then the inflation factor that you're adding into your calculation. And for other housing authorities, it's also, we get per the units leased. reimbursed. So we only get reimbursed not for our total eligibility. So if we're able to serve 3,400, but we only had 3,000 least because that's all we could afford, we're only getting reimbursed for those 3,000.
Right.
And so it's pretty similar. The only difference is that inflation factor varies by housing authority. The rest of the proration part is pretty much the standard, but then depending on the jurisdiction, and HUD gives those amounts out. And a lot of times it's flat. It has been flat for the last few years.
Yeah, so it's more expensive to manage those here, but you're getting the same as other jurisdictions that are maybe it's less expensive to manage those vouchers. Is that what you're saying there, or is there an adjustment from one county to the next?
There's adjustment from different areas. So like ours would be like a regional metro, right? I think we have the same as the Portland, Vancouver, Clackamas, and Washington counties all in that same. And then it could be a little bit different in the bands for our areas when they publish that amount of what our inflation factor is, and then our proration. I feel like you want.
I think the answer to your question is that there's broad consistency because it's highly regulated by HUD. I think what might be unique in Washington County is that we do have high rents and we have high voucher payment standards. And so what might be different is that we, because of those high costs and our high voucher payment standards, that will be a nice segue to our next topic. We could be serving more households if we weren't spending as much on each individual voucher. And then we'd be serving more households, and we'd also be generating a higher utilization rate on our front. So, but I think generally across housing authorities, it's comparable in terms of the board game that HUD sets out.
Yeah.
And on
This is
this,
about that.
Yeah.
and on the slide 22 about the current average voucher cost of $1,275, that is for our locality on average. I mean, I was talking to Salem, they're more like in the $700. So it does differ, but in general.
Thanks. Yeah, we need to move on time-wise.
Okay, thank you. Well, and it was a great primer for my topic, so in that budget will be in mind as we kind of go through this. Next is the voucher payment standards. So good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Liz Morris, the Rental Assistance Division Manager. And I'm here today to go over some of our changes that we're making. What is the purpose of a voucher payment standard revision? It is standard operations for us to always review and potentially change, but we're going to be changing it a little bit different this year. What the new payment standard schedule will be, how we came to this decision process and the thoughtfulness behind it, and then our implementation plan. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions as we go through. I will ask that if there are some clarifications, especially because we do sometimes get acronymy, if I try not to, but I still sometimes default into that. So if there's something that you need clarification on the site, please let me know. And then at the end, we'll get to the discussion part. So our purpose, we're going to inform you today about our payment standard change. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So HUD does require that housing authorities, the public housing authorities, set an annual payment standard. This comes when they publish the annual fair market rents. Usually that is published in the fall, so that is the trigger point because HUD requires that housing authorities standardly, and sometimes with some MTW flexibilities, or as we saw during the COVID errors, that range could change a little bit, but it is typically between 90% and 110% of fair market rents. And what does the payment standard do? It sets the standard so the maximum amount of subsidy that we could pay per voucher and per voucher size that the household is eligible for.
Steve Rudman always say, it's your spending money. It's how much you can go out and spend in the market. Yes. Your allowance.
Yes.
It's hard.
No, it's okay.
Yes.
So what we're doing this revision is because we've seen something. I've been in this industry and housing authorities for 18 years now, and only one other time has fair market rents reduced, and we've seen it reduced for the last 2 years. So typically it's going up, and we obviously we don't know. We can project that there was inflation around COVID or other factors that raised the fair market rents higher, and now they're leveling back down. But since HUD has lowered the fair market rents in 2025 and 2026, we have not changed our payment standards since 2024. Because they've set at a flat rate. So when they were going down, we were kind of making sure they were in between that 90 and 110%. So our current standards, because they have not changed, are actually falling between 105 and 107. So when they originally set, they were at 100% of fair market. And so that's where we've seen that gap continue to grow. This gap actually continues to risk our shortfall. You've heard me talk about shortfall and how we keep continuing having those very narrow margins. And Ryan and Steve and Jill prompted you all of that very narrow margins that we do have in the voucher program. And it continues to give us that risk, as well as we haven't been able to serve anybody off of our wait list in over 3 years. So our wait list was created in 2021. We did an original poll and we're able to serve about 100 people off of that wait list, but we haven't touched it since, in the sense of taking vouchers from that. So we are deciding to reduce our payment standards to help the ability of both our cost effectiveness, so we can continue to serve people, reduce this gap for our funding shortfall, and the ability to be able to potentially serve some more households. So again, why is this needed? It's because the fair market rents have been dropped 2 years. Our current payment standards are 105 to 107%. And this sustained higher housing assistance, as was pointed out, was the $12.75 for us in Washington County, is the highest in the state. And we do need to see that number go down because we continue to be at risk of shortfall. And a lot of housing authorities are at risk of shortfall. And there's only one bucket of money to potentially help housing authorities if they do enter shortfall. And there's no guarantee that even if we do fully enter shortfall, that we would actually get money to get back. So we really want to continue to right our ship. So before we go to the next slide, I'm going to sit at it for a minute because it's going to be a chart with our payment standards and numbers, and I want you to be able to absorb it. I'm not going to read each line, but it'll give you an idea of what the new payment standards will be set and where they land against the current fair market rents that were established in 2026. Again, those were published in October of 2025, effective for the 2026 year. And so this will give you an idea of what our new payment standards are. So as our new payment standards in bold is the middle schedule there. And as you can see, we are reducing them down below 100% of the current fair market rents. And they kind of line up a little bit different depending on the bedroom size. They are a bit higher as it goes to the 3-bedroom and on to the 97 due to the single, most likely households could be in a apartment style home, but they are most likely in a single unit residence, and those rents can be higher. Lots of analysis went through this process, and we'll kind of go through what that decision process was and where we got to this number. If we go on to the next slide. All right, so with this, we spent several months, a lot of analytics, a lot of discussions, a lot of considerations on how this impacts our households. Because these are numbers that we're trying to do the gaps, but we know these are people, right, that are going to be impacted. So we use tools to forecast what is the current makeup, where is our current average household sitting at right now, where are those lines that we saw, for identifying specific gaps. We did this full review of different scenarios. What if we did no change? What if we only changed it moving forward for households that are coming onto the program or when they move? And how will this kind of impact? Because we had some key factors that we really wanted to get to. So we did applied a disparate impact lens through our analysis, and we did again, spend multiple times going back and forth and understanding what all of the impacts will be. Go to the next slide, please. So as we were looking at what our goals were, we really were kind of grounded in a couple of key identities. Like, so as you have heard us talk about, one of HUD's early sunsets of the emergency housing voucher program, which we originally had 89, but we still have currently 77 households on. We didn't have the funds to support those households just as is, right? So we've been contemplating how can we support that. So one of our goals was how do we absorb those households into our current housing choice voucher program? We want to project savings and a per unit cost. So we wanted to see a reduction in that per unit cost on average that we keep continuing to pay out per household, and establish some reserves that go between 0.5% and 1%. And again, this is where the slim margin, as Ryan was saying, because we do want to be able to serve more people in the community. So we want to keep it enough that we have some reserves for operations. But if you have too much reserves, HUD then wants to take that back as well. So you're always operating between that 2% and 0% to be in good standard. And our goal would be, we would love to be minimally at the 0.5 to 1%. And we wanted to really also ensure that we were reviewing the impact for the extreme rent burden household. So rent burden as a whole could be defined anybody paying more than 30 or 40%. That's a general, just rent burden. They're paying more than 30 or 40% of their income towards rent. Extreme rent burden happens if they're paying 50% or more of their rent towards their income towards their rent. Next slide, please. So with the payment standards, we're, as you saw the numbers, they were bringing us down to around a 95, 97%. So we're averaging around as a housing authority at a 96% of their market rents. With this, we are going to see that total annual reduction in HAP costs that we're projecting. Now, this is only as, again, Ryan mentioned sausage, right? Like this being made, it is a crystal ball sometimes, and there's other outside factors that continue to go. So this number might change, but as this is forecasting implementing this, we could save up to $1.1 million in HAP, which is about $91,000 per month. That per unit cost, though, is the savings of about $47.51. So the goal would be bringing down from like that $12.75 average to closer to the $12.30. And we would be able to absorb all of our emergency housing vouchers by doing this and serve up to 50 new households off of our wait list. We'd actually be able to start pulling off our wait list. So it feels like a loss, but we're also going to be able to serve more people with this decision. It also gives us that, I feel like we just kind of nailed that 0.7 goal, like right in the middle of between that 0.5 and 1%. So it would help us maintain that reserves at 0.7. Again, this is forecasted with these changes. Utilization would still hover around 89%. If we don't change anything, we would see that go all the way down to 97 or 87%. Sorry. I know, I was like, okay. That was a wishful, that was optimistic wishful, Liz, that we would be at the high. We would see it go down with no change. And that's because through attrition, we wouldn't be able to even backfill those vouchers as well. So this change, it doesn't get us above 90% and closer to 94, which would be our ultimate goal, but it at least stabilizes us so we're not dipping further down into the 80% of utilization, because we can't utilize households if we don't have the funds to actually continue to pay out. So next slide, please. So more about the impact for the households. Again, we are really reviewing, and we see that in our current payment standards, we'll take a little bit look at the chart on the left there. Households currently that are paying over our payment standard at this moment are about 509 households. Anything of this, when we say that, it could be they're paying between 30, they could be paying 31%, right? So HUD does define affordability at paying 40% and below. When somebody moves with their voucher into a new unit, we actually cannot approve it if they would be paying more than 40%. But what happens after they move in and year goes on, the landlord could be increasing the rent. they could have a household member leave and maybe they reduce their voucher size, but they don't want to move because of the cost of moving or because of that household meets their needs. So that's where the choice in housing choice comes into. Once they've identified, they have to still continue to make those decisions for themselves. Is this still a viable unit for me because their portion is going up? We're paying the maximum that we can pay on their behalf. So those households that are at that edge, we are paying the maximum and then they're paying addition above that to cover the rent. With this change, we're gonna see that there is going to be an increase in households that are gonna be above that 30%. So where they're gonna be paying a little bit more per month on average. And where we are going to continue to give, and you'll see in the implementation process about how this notice is going to go out to households, so they'll be notified of that impact. And we really were identifying those extreme burden households. A lot of that times we call it overhoused. Again, you have like a household that might be eligible for a 2-bedroom, living in a 4-bedroom because of those circumstances with people moving out and just not moving. And it could have been affordable for a while and maybe it's not. We know that it's a very small percentage, and if we go to the next slide, we're gonna really be proactively trying to support all of our households, but really the ones that we know are gonna have that major impact, reaching out to them individually, and in addition to the general notice that's going out, connecting on any resources, ensuring that they understand what does that mean when this is implemented, what their portion will be, so they can hopefully plan for that as it comes into line, ensuring that they understand any hardship process, and then monitor those outcomes. We're going to continue as we're always reviewing those analytical tools. A lot of those tools that we use are some that we're just continually checking on a regular basis, minimally annually, but sometimes even more. All right, so we're going to switch over to our implementation plan. So a lot of this is regulated by HUD. Our new payment standards are going to be effective. It's going to be effective and published for July 1, 2026. And that means that any household that comes into our programs, and so we're still receiving new households with our special purpose voucher program. So you're like, wait, I thought you were not issuing new folks. Our Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing, we do have Mainstream. And we have people porting in, we have admin transfers, we have project-based lease ups. So those, when we say new, we're counting those households. And then anybody who requests to move with their voucher for continued assistance and they want to take their voucher and move it from another unit, if they move in July 1 or later, they will have the new payment standards, and that's where their rent calculation will come from. If they move in June 30th, they'll actually be under the old standards with a notice that this is going to change and when it's going to change. This is the fun part, is the HUD requires us to give a 12-month notice that we're giving them a 12-month notice. Because it is very, yes, and that is how the regulation reads, and it's when you read it and you're like, wait a second, I thought we just have to give a 12-month notice, and you're like, no, it's a 12-month notice of a 12-month notice. So we are going to be sending out the notice. And that's why we won't really start rolling in, and households won't have that change of the payment standard, and they won't see that change for the currently leased who are not moving until July 1, 2028, when we start doing the recertifications at that time, and that's when it's going to be implemented. So by 2029, we would have gone through that whole cycle, and everybody in our portfolio will have that new payment standard as the expectation. All right. Next slide. So as we're going through, we've been sharing this process out with, like I said, multiple months of meeting together, sharing it out with our leadership team, our rental assistance leadership team, rental assistance division staff got notified this last Tuesday, and all the impacts that it's going to be for our participants and how it'll impact their work to communicate this with the participants. We're informing you all today. We're going to be sending out the notice as the FYI to everybody, and also to our current shoppers, because again, that date, if they're shopping for a unit and they lease up prior, it's going to be under the old affordability, the new. So if they turn especially when it gets to the last couple of weeks in June, when we're kind of navigating inspection and move in, it can make a difference if it's gonna be affordable. For them to, or eligible for them to move in. And then we're going to our Housing Authority Board of Directors on May 5th. All right, that was a lot. And I'll just, before we go to questions, and before I invite Molly or Jill, if they have anything they'd like to add, I do want to still continue to acknowledge that we know this is going to be impacting people. And we're going to be as mindful and helpful and supportive of the folks that it's going to impact. But it's clearly needed for us to continue to make sure that we can viably serve our entire portfolio and to be able to continue to serve those emergency housing vouchers and potentially more in our community. So it does feel like a right direction that we're moving towards.
I just want to acknowledge this is a very rare instance in the world of that we're used to in decades wise. So that I just want to emphasize that we don't take this lightly in coming into this decision, but we have to adjust to market conditions. We want to make sure we're not over subsidizing landlords in this marketplace because we have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the number of households to be served. And along those same lines, I just want to be clear, this in no way changes a landlord's ability to increase their rents. All this is really shifting is the amount that we are using, that those households are getting in their shopping money. So this, the benefits outweigh being able to absorb, make sure we have housing stability for our over 70 households who are getting emergency housing vouchers is a primary public benefit to why we're doing this. And I will say other housing authority, there are so many housing authorities across the country that are hovering shortfall or are in shortfall, and they're having to make way more drastic policy decisions, like increasing the portion of people's income towards rent. So this is where we are in a environment, depending on how the next, we're all dependent on the federal appropriations. And that this is we feel a modest step to keep up with where the market conditions are. And to keep us out of shortfall. And that's just, I just want to recognize that there are other housing authorities doing way more drastic.
And from my perspective, I want to thank, Liz for leading this effort. Like she mentioned, it's a 3 months plus effort to look at the housing data and really figure out where can we tinker without impacting with the minimal impact, trying to optimize, how much funds we will have available to serve not only the EHV, but the thousands. We have thousands of people who've been on our wait list forever, it seems. I mean, this is just a little trickle.
Is this going to council or the board, or what are the next steps for this decision-making process?
The board will be informed of the decision that's been made on May 5th.
It's an administrative decision that the executive director can make here about. It's an annual thing we do. It's just, this one is particularly unusual. That's why we've never presented it before. Because we just kind of held steady or have done slight upticks. But we wanted to bring this to your attention, especially as you may hear from other partners. And of course, we're doing the board presentation, and it's just awareness, but
it's awareness.
And for those, especially like Nathan, who is one of our affordable housing owner developers, this does not impact the affordable housing standard for our vouchers. It actually is a slight increase, but now the affordable, and you can call it quote unquote the market, which we're now calling standard, they'll be sort of aligned. It does not mean that we will always keep them aligned because we don't know what the market will be.
So Nathan, we hope that makes you, I'll reassure you, it won't adjust your payment standards in your properties unless they're larger bedroom sizes. And then in that case, you can actually go up. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan.
Just one comment for the layman, that it would be helpful to know what, I know the AMI percentage we're talking about, but what does that translate into when you're saying like, the payment standard schedule is very helpful.
Okay,
Knowing what that payment is compared to what the range of rent is. So in other words, just for us as a layman to know what the gap would be for a
So you
person.
mean like if we were looking at this 2-bedroom,
Yeah,
what is it in terms of AMI for 2-bedroom?
exactly. Like what is, so in a 2-bedroom, you're saying you're gonna have a $1,825 payment.
Yeah.
What is the cost of rent right now for a 2-bedroom right now that we're seeing? Is
Got it.
like, and what realistically is gonna be the gap that someone's gonna be paying?
Right, because I know that the 1825 for 2-bedroom
Uh-huh.
is significantly, it's about $150, $170 higher than the 60% AMI rent.
Okay.
So it's
Yeah.
more like 90, maybe. But we will find that. That's a great comment.
Just as like a, sometimes just really helpful to understand and see like what's the gap?
Yep.
That they will be actually.
And you have 6-bedroom unit?
That's what I
I think there's like maybe like 7 to 10 households.
That's crazy.
Like in our portfolio.
Yeah.
Multi-generation.
Yeah.
Any other-
And also not very many 5 bedrooms, but we do see the majority of our households in 1, 2s, and 3s. Like that is
Yeah.
probably 80%, if not more, of our portfolio.
Any other questions or comments from the committee?
And really truly, we need your input about, was this user friendly enough? Was this digestible enough? It is a really hard amount of numbers and metrics to throw at people. We're gonna present to the board, anything you think we should tweak, and I thought, Haley, your comment is spot on, over how does that translate to AMIs?
Yeah.
Bringing that heart of, we know it's people, and that outreach was really helpful. I know you can't plan for everyone, but we also know that there isn't also rent burden, there's also medical cost burden. A lot of times people on vouchers have both. And yeah, the AMI comparison, what's it really mean? But that you're really saying, everyone's taking a pay cut so we can serve more people. That's what it comes down to, and serving
Very
more
few,
people.
0.25%.
Yeah.
0.25.
I think you did a great job of summarizing it. I do think like the burden change after, and now understanding it's like a year or two down the road. If the fair market rents are dropping, is that really what's happening in the underlying, like the properties that that you have vouchers in? Are the rent trends actually increasing year to year? Because it does seem like is the fair market rent sort of the macro, federal, regional, local, but the reality is the Washington County rents that you're seeing, that many of the vouchers, the properties you're in, are actually trending up. So when you look at that burden chart, it seems like that's a picture in time right now.
Yeah.
Right, but is that actually reflecting what's happening with the underlying properties?
That's a good question, and I think my initial response would be, if I think about our leasing up success rate. So voucher holders with their current voucher who are shopping, we have about a 70% lease up success rate, which on average for housing authorities is closer to 50%. So people are not having trouble finding the units, they might just have, but so we know that there is a gap, and we are seeing landlords increasing rents like steady, but we've seen that gap of like increasing $100 per year down to like smaller amounts of like $25 because they want to do it to cover their operations, but equally having as many vacancies and trying to fill those vacancies. And so having these like, oh, the first month's free and all these other incentives, because there is this kind of this flux. So it's kind of interesting when you look at that and we look at people shopping there, when they search for a unit. We do have like housing support sometimes if somebody's really having a hard time. And it doesn't mean that there's not pockets of households, like those really large households, maybe somebody needing a specific accessibility unit that they might not have a little bit more difficulty finding, but our average shopper and they're finding success in leasing up. So, but it's a good question.
And I would lead with that 2 year, like, this is gonna take 2 years. People have 2 years to adjust. I think as crazy as that sounded at first, it's actually a positive of. So, yeah.
I have one question which might allude to my ignorance in a lot of how this works, but are these payments for people that are living in housing that is just already structured affordable housing, or are these payments for people that are also living in natural occurring affordable housing?
Oh,
yeah. Is there any way to acknowledge or delineate that in the understanding of like the impact to people that are receiving payment? How many of them are living in structured affordable housing and how many of them are living in natural occurring?
And some are living in market rate.
Right.
So when we publish this, actually on our website, we do actually end up with 2 schedules. Affordable regulated residents and the market rate residents. We just happen to, the moon's aligned this year.
Okay.
We're adopting the same.
Okay.
Doesn't mean the moons will align every year. But that's just, so for the ease of public consumption, it is, we will reserve the right to have potentially 2 separate schedules that will end up being different numbers. It's just this year it happens.
2 different schedules of payment.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have 2, one for affordable.
Yeah.
One for market rate. They happen to be the same numbers this year.
This year.
And Haley, for our payments to affordable housing owners, for example, in project-based vouchers, we don't use the 60% AMI rent. We use our affordable payments, which is what Liz was talking about.
Yes.
Which is this.
You use it, yeah,
This,
okay.
not the 60% that many developers are used to thinking.
Okay.
So there's no reduction.
Yeah, and there was no reduction in any of those payments. It's
Okay.
actually a small increase.
Understood.
So
That's
95 to 97% of FMR exceeds a 60% max rent.
Yeah.
Thank
Does that
you.
make sense?
Yes, there's a lot of acronyms there, but I'm following. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
Yes.
Well exceeds.
Okay,
And exceeds.
So
Thank
it's
you.
like a little extra subsidy.
I think that is an important story to tell. Or to elaborate on.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so I think with that, we are at time and that was our last topic. So I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Right, can I get a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Okay, meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Congratulations.
Oh.